Okay, so a funny thing happens whenever we embark on any project or mission, whenever we set out to do anything. At the end of it, we'll have either gotten closer to it, further away, or there'll be no change at all. As far as I know, those are the only three options. I'm not sure of any other options. Now, there'll always be reasons for why it happens, but ultimately, we're either going towards, away, or staying the same to whatever degree this is. And we're going to measure the success of how we did based primarily on the expectations about it, the goals and the expectations. So the question then becomes, since we're playing all these games in our lives all the time, we're always setting about to do something, we always want to improve situations. How are we able to afterwards look at it and to ensure that the next game is going to be more successful? How are we able to stop a slide if it happens? So if we're winning, how do we strengthen it? If we're not winning, how do we reverse things so we can win? Well, the United States Army looked at this question in the 1970s. They're always undergoing missions. This is what they do. And they came up with something called the AAR. The AAR is an acronym for After Action Review. I've also heard it written or stated as After Action Report. But it's an opportunity to look retrospectively and to see what happened. Was it successful? Why or why not? And what can be done going forward? And the Army is very into this stuff, right? I mean, they are all about performance. When it comes to war, when it comes to a game like war, there really is only winning or losing. Even though, as I said, degrees always exist, right? But they're a very bottom line organization, and they study these things. Now, first of all, the reason that they developed this AAR in the first place was because they used to do something very different. They used to have what's called a performance critique. So basically, the commanding officer, after a mission, would look at it and he would sit everyone down and speak to them. He'd lecture them. He'd critique them. He said, this is what he would say, this is what did not work. This is what you need to do. And it was found that that was not as effective as a participatory kind of a process. It didn't work as well. There's several reasons for that. There's several organizational reasons for it. One of them, obviously, is that it didn't involve the participants. And it often insulted them and, it put them down. The commanding officer, as the head guy in charge, would often be very blamey. All of these things kind of come into play, right? So that's why and how the AAR was developed. It was developed so that it could be a more participatory process. And it could focus a bit more on building team. Now, this has been considered a huge victory by the Army. This is considered one of the greatest organizational initiatives in the history of man or organizations. Apparently, this is what I read. So the AAR came into place, and let me give you a definition, so I'm not just giving you my opinion. The AAR, here's the definition. The After Action Report is a retrospective analysis of a series of goal-oriented actions that have already been taken. It's often prepared by the author of the actions themselves. AARs can be used to analyze the management or response to an event, exercise, or incident. Their purpose is to identify strengths to build upon, identify areas for improvement, provide lessons learned, provide best practices, make recommendations for future planning, training, and exercise development. And as I said, this is considered a huge success in organizational growth in psychology, so much so that AARs were adopted by some of the biggest businesses and organizations in the world, including places like Microsoft. It was not only kept confined to the Army, but they were not a perfect tool. for the reasons that I mentioned. And often they were done in a very kind of a glib or superficial way, right? Very rote, very mechanical. Okay, this is what was done. This is what worked. This is what did it. And so I read an article by a group of authors who decided to see if they could improve the way that these AARs were performed. So they started studying it. Now, there are people that are doing this. There are people who look at things like this, which is kind of cool when you think about it, right? But there are people who study organizations, they study neuropsychiatry, and they kind of put all of these things together. So when I read this article, by the way, it's in Harvard Business Review. It's called A Better Approach to After Action Reviews. Their conclusions were pretty interesting. They decided to make some changes to the way that AARs were commonly done based on some lessons that they learned, some conclusions that they reached. Now, one of the things that they decided to improve upon, first of all, they kind of formalized the process, right? So they created these 4 questions, and this is the basic structure of the AAR. And here are the 4 questions. What did we expect to happen? Number 1. Number 2, what actually happened? Number 3, why was there a difference between what we expected and what actually happened? And number 4, what can we change next time? So that couldn't be simpler, and that was being done in one way or another before the authors decided to address these questions, right? Some version of that was always being done during AARs. But they learned some valuable lessons. First of all, what they learned was that AARs are always being performed, whether formally or not. In other words, after some kind of an action, individuals themselves are always going to be looking back and saying, okay, this is why this thing worked or why it didn't work. This is what could be done better next time. So they concluded from that it's definitely better to have a team narrative than a bunch of different separate narratives. They also, interestingly enough, concluded that narrative matters. And here is a very interesting topic, because I feel like anybody who's at the head of an organization doesn't want to hear much about narratives. You want to hear about bottom line. You want to hear about processes, procedures, data, ultimately. I mean, as parents, you ask your children a question, why didn't you clean up after we told you to? And who knows what you're liable to get. Well, we were still playing. We didn't think we had to. I wasn't feeling well. My doll broke and I had to fix the doll. You don't know what you're going to get. But so there is this kind of a conflict here, right? There's always some conflict that needs to be resolved. But just organizationally, in looking at these AARs, there is this conflict between, on the one hand, wanting and needing the data, and bosses and organizational leaders can often be very bottom line and want to know those facts. And the absolute unassailable fact that people run based on stories and narratives. Now, this led the authors of this article to kind of go in a different direction. And the conclusion was to be much less focused on the processes than they are on the teams and on the individuals. In other words, on the softer things, on the things that might be tougher to quantify, because ultimately the changes that you want are organizational changes. changes in the attitude and the behaviors of the people, as opposed to simply a road process by which you say, okay, these are the procedures that we have to do differently. Now, that's a pretty interesting and significant shift when you really look at it. And it reminds me of someone I know. I know this gal, and she actually works with organizations. She's kind of a consultant. And she took this one company who was really struggling, and she basically turned them around. And I called her and I said, I'm interested in what you did. And I took a tour of the office, and I went in there and I looked at all the processes and all the procedures, and everything was done, very well, very much to a T. And I got into a certain area of the office that focused on admin, on administration. For those of you who don't say things like admin. And up on the wall was kind of like the mission of the company. And you would think the mission would be like, to provide the best service in our field and to blah, 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 and this and that. And it was nothing like that at all. The mission was something to the effect of, we create valuable people who in turn create value in other people. I mean, it was that kind of airy-fairy kind of thing. And I'm kind of looking at it, and I have my, hand on my chin, and I'm like, what is this about? And she sees me doing that. She sees me going through my thing here. And she's like, what do you think about that? And I'm like, this is very interesting. This says nothing about what the company does. Now, the company is involved in construction, a niche area in construction. And yet nothing about their actual services and what they created was mentioned. Not we create the best, the best homes and the greatest drywall and the best exteriors. I mean, it was nothing like that. And we do it at a reasonable price. None of that. It talked about the people in their organization and the effect of those people on other people. And I said, what is this about? Why would you have this? And she said, our focus is on improving our people, because if tomorrow we had to go into another business and our people were as productive and as bright and as trained as they should be, we can do it in a snap. We could just convert to something else. Those would be technical changes. That's the core of our organization. And I thought that is interesting as hell. It's a shift that I don't know if most organizations can make. First of all, I mean, if you focus more on your internal people than on the products and on the processes, that's a lot of heavy lifting, or it would seem to be. But she's right. If the market in her field totally changed around, if something went crazy in that field of construction, in that niche field of construction that they were in, and they decided to shift, they could do it pretty easily because they would have the people who were capable enough. And that's what the focus was. And that's kind of what I got from this article that I was reading. The focus was all about the team, the narratives of the team. When narratives are, again, the last thing you want to hear often, but it's how people think. People don't think in terms of data. They think in terms of ideas and in terms of stories. Now, this is maybe a revolutionary idea when it comes to organizations and businesses, or it may not be. It may just be that it's how things are supposed to be. That is what to focus on. even when you want to focus on the exterior, superficial stuff. Maybe that doesn't work as well as focusing on the character of the organization. Now, an organization, by the way, sometimes when we're thinking about it, we're thinking of it as ourselves as individuals, right? We set out individually to accomplish something. So I speak about this in terms of team and in terms of organization. That's how it's been studied. But there are single people projects. Maybe most of the projects we engage in are single people focused projects, right? So it would work for us as well. And then additionally, when you think about it, right, we often think about what we do. You know, oh, I should have done this, or next time I'll do this. But what if the focus was not on that? What if the focus was on the internal growth that was needed? Because it was the story about ourselves or about what we were capable of that was dictating what we actually did, the degree to which we did it. What if that became the focus? And the idea was, okay, what does it take to improve me? Not in a blamey way, right? Because it's very easy to go there. You know, just to go on a short little tangent, one of the difficulties that the authors of this article speak about when they're talking about AARs, or when they're talking about this group kind of process that takes place, this discussion, is that some people see everything as external to themselves, right? Well, I couldn't do it because of these issues in the world at large. And other people always come up and say it was all about me. I failed. It's all my responsibility. And it's probably the case that neither of those things are true, but people tend to think in terms of those ways, right? But again, if the focus was on more internal growth as opposed to external processes and achievements and circumstances, what would happen then? And that's where I'm going to leave you. Let's just take a look at that and see what you come up with. Okay, so that's going to be it for today. Happy Monday. We're getting into mid-August. Actually, some of the hotter states in the West are starting school today. Society is going to change as it always does with the seasons, and our processes change. And maybe that's food for thought for children as well. You know, how can they grow such that their grades will improve and they won't beat up their little brothers and sisters? All right, take care.